Welcome to the Language Alchemy podcast, where you transform how you communicate to create the life and relationships you truly want. I'm your host, Alejandra Siroka, and I help multicultural individuals, couples, and change makers move beyond surface level politeness and conflict avoidance to have authentic, value-based interactions that actually resolve issues and deepen connection. If you are tired of rehashing conversations in your head, walking on eggshells, or feeling misunderstood in your most important relationships, this podcast will give you a new way forward. Today, we are exploring one of the most challenging aspects of conscious communication: how to navigate conversations about what's going on in the world when the world feels like it's breaking apart around us. As I record this episode, it is the anniversary of the Hamas attack on Israel that occurred on October 7, 2023. And I know many of you are feeling the weight of this war, as well as so many other ongoing global crises. Now, I want to be clear from the start. I am not a political commentator, and my role isn't to analyze geopolitics or tell you what to think about complex international situations. But as someone who teaches conscious communication, I believe it is essential that we learn to have meaningful conversations about heartbreaking events that are impacting our whole world. These events also affect us at a personal level, not only because we are all interconnected, but also because we all have feelings, ideas, beliefs, and reactions about what's going on in Gaza. In this episode, you will hear about why the urge of immediately taking sides during crises often shuts down real dialogue. You'll also learn how to anchor yourself in your values when your emotions are running high and everyone around you seems to be reacting from fear or anger. I will share practical communication tools that can help you engage with these difficult topics without losing your center or damaging your relationships. My goal is that by the end of this episode, you will have a framework for communicating about any crisis, whether it's global conflicts, community tensions, or family disagreements, in a way that creates more connection rather than more division. As you listen to this episode, I invite you to think about others who could benefit from learning these transformative communication tools, and then share this episode with them. The whole world will thank you. I've been sitting with a lot of grief, and I imagine you might be too. Maybe you've been watching the news about the ongoing crisis in Israel and Gaza, a conflict that, according to Reuters, it has now claimed the lives of over 64,000 Palestinians and about 2,000 Israelis, with thousands more missing and presumed dead. We are witnessing Palestinian families facing confirmed famine conditions in Gaza City, with around 90% of Gaza's population displaced from their homes. We are seeing Israeli families grieving those lost in the initial attacks and living with the pain that hostages taken on October 7th, 2023 still remain captive. Maybe you found yourself staying silent when this topic comes up at dinner tables, in work meetings, or in casual conversations. Maybe you've been feeling a lot of sadness, grief, anger, despair, confusion, but you didn't know how to bring it up, even with the closest people in your life. Or perhaps you've jumped into conversations only to watch them spiral into arguments that leave everyone feeling more disconnected than before. Or maybe you've had heated exchanges on social media that left you spinning for days and feeling incensed and hopeless. These moments test everything we know about conscious communication. We're not just navigating differences of opinion. We are touching something primal in all of us: our deep need for safety, justice, and belonging. But these conversations also present us with communication challenges unlike most others we face. For one, the political stakes feel enormous. Secondly, people aren't just sharing opinions, they are declaring their moral stance on human suffering. Thirdly, the historical complexity runs centuries deep. What's more, most of us don't have the full context of the religious, cultural, and geopolitical layers that shape this crisis. I know I don't. All these elements lead to an overwhelming sense of emotional intensity. When we are talking about children dying of starvation, families displaced, and communities under attack, how do we stay centered enough to communicate skillfully? I understand firsthand how challenging this is to talk about. Something I've noticed in the conversations with my friends and family, and also from what my coaching clients have talked about in our sessions, is that this particular conflict brings up an urgency to be right or to be seen as right. In these conversations, we may feel the first thing we must immediately declare is which side deserves our support. But this is a trap. When we approach these discussions from I'm with this side and against that other side, this places us in a who's right and who's wrong stance. When this happens, we stop listening and we abandon the conversation about the crises. In the who's right, who's wrong conversations, we no longer genuinely engage with the complexity and pain that everyone is feeling. And we are more likely to defend our position rather than be open and curious to have meaningful and connecting dialogue. Because we are now in a space of presenting ourselves and dramatizing our moralistic thinking. And in this space, it's hard to be authentic, but it's easy to be performative. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't important moral questions at stake when it comes to what's occurring in Gaza. There absolutely are. But when our communication is driven primarily by the need to prove that we are on the right side, we often end up shutting down not only the possibility of dialogue, but we also shut down the possibility of others feeling safe to express their feelings with us. And that causes more harm than healing. Think about the last time you witnessed or participated in a conversation about the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. Did it bring people together or push them further apart? Did it increase understanding or deepen divisions? Most of the time, when we communicate from this either or mindset, we create exactly the kind of polarization that makes these problems harder to talk about, let alone solve. So how do we speak about something this complex and emotionally charged without losing our way? The answer lies in one of the core principles of language alchemy, which is about getting crystal clear on your values and anchoring your communication in them. And how do you do that? Well, before you enter any conversation about the Israel-Gaza crisis, pause and ask yourself these 3 questions. Number 1, what value do I most want to embody in this conversation? Number 2, am I speaking from my values or from a need to be right? And number 3, what outcome am I hoping for? Connection or conquest? These 3 questions help you shift from reactive communication to conscious communication. Instead of being pulled into the emotional whirlwind that often surrounds these topics, you become anchored in something deeper and more stable. With the first question, what value do I most want to embody in this conversation? You are creating a container for the space you want to enter into with others as you discuss this highly sensitive topic. The second question, am I speaking from my values or from a need to be right? With this question, you are reminding yourself about whether you're honoring your values or whether you're indulging in a communication pattern that brings divisiveness. And the third question, what outcome am I hoping for? connection, or conquest, you are keeping yourself accountable and directing your words, body language, and tone of voice towards your value of connection. So if things start to get derailed, you can redirect the conversation to have your desired outcome. What values do you choose as your anchoring place to have these conversations? Well, while there are many values you may want to ground yourself in my work, I've seen how choosing one main value as your communication anchor can transform even the most difficult conversations. Let me share some examples of how this might sound when you anchor yourself in a specific value when discussing the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. If you anchor yourself in the value of compassion, you may say something like, when I think about the scale of the suffering, my heart breaks for every single person affected. How do we hold space for all this pain while holding the possibility that there can be a resolution and a ceasefire that can prevent more people from being killed? Or let's say you anchor yourself in your value of humility. Then you can acknowledge what you do not know or do not understand and say something like, I don't fully understand all the historical complexities that led us here. The mere idea that more than 66,000 people are dead and hundreds of thousands of people are missing and displaced is so overwhelming. Or let's say that you hear others talk about the conflict and they ask you about what you think. If you are anchored in your value of humility, you could say something like, I am heartbroken and I am committed to listening to people who have lived this reality, and I'm learning from different perspectives before I feel that my opinion can contribute to peace. And speaking of peace, what if you anchor yourself in the value of peace? Well, then you could say something like, when I see reports of famine in Gaza City and families in Israel still mourning loved ones lost in the October 7th attacks, I keep coming back to wishing for something that would actually help create safety for both peoples who just want to live their lives in peace. Now, if you want to anchor in the value of justice, you can say something like, whether I'm reading about Palestinian children dying from starvation or Israeli families with loved ones still held hostage, I am committed to supporting approaches that protect human dignity for all people in this region. And how about the value of connection? Well, if you'd like to anchor yourself in that value of connection, and especially when you notice that the conversation is escalating and you and the other person may have different opinions and feelings, you could say something like, even when we see this crisis differently, I want to understand what's in your heart when you think about families on both sides who are suffering from this war. Notice how each of these approaches opens dialogue rather than shutting it down. They invite curiosity rather than defensiveness. They acknowledge complexity rather than demanding simple answers. One of the most skillful and mature things you can do in conversations about the Israeli-Palestinian crisis is to admit that you don't know. In our social media age, we feel pressure to have immediate opinions about complex situations and even to express them with a sense of certainty and confidence. But if you are aware that you only know a minute fraction of this multidimensional conflict, then your most powerful contribution to these conversations is your willingness to say that you don't have all there is to know about this conflict. And you can say something like, the scale of this crisis is overwhelming, and I don't have complete knowledge of all the complexities. Or you could say something like, I'm still learning about the history and trying to understand different perspectives. Or you could say, I wish I could answer your questions, yet I do not comprehend the magnitude of complexities. Or, I have more questions than answers. This kind of vulnerable, mature honesty often creates more space for genuine dialogue than any political position could. It models intellectual humility, which is desperately needed in our current cultural moment. When you lead with, I don't know, you're not being weak or uncommitted. You are being honest about the limitations of your perspective while staying connected to your values. You are creating space for others to share their knowledge and experience without feeling like they have to defend against your certainty. I know this approach isn't always easy. If your family, friends, or community expects you to take a clear side, staying anchored in your communication values can feel lonely or even risky. You might worry that people will think you don't care enough or that you're being wishy-washy about important moral issues. I myself have been very curious about how people are navigating peer pressure, and I want to share a couple of examples I heard that are in complete alignment with language alchemy. The first one is from a client who works in an organization where everyone was making strong public statements condemning Israel and Jewish people. And of course, the situation was more complex than her colleagues were acknowledging. Instead of staying silent and then falling into the feeling that there was something wrong with her for not saying anything, my client anchored herself in her value of compassion. She told her colleagues that looking at this from a compassionate perspective was important for her, and that she wanted everyone to know this topic felt extremely painful and personal for her. She said she empathized with the shock, horror, and anger that so many were expressing, and she let everybody know that as a Jewish person, she was pained to see how people still didn't see that being Jewish does not automatically mean agreeing with or supporting the Israeli government decisions. She talked to her colleagues about how being Jewish was not synonymous of hating or wanting to kill or displace Palestinians. My client's authentic communication opened a conversation about how to talk about this highly sensitive topic without speaking about it in a way that fostered unconscious anti-Semitism. Her communication was so beneficial that her colleagues said, it would be more accurate to start saying the Israeli government instead of Jews or Jewish people when we talk about the war. This suggestion didn't come from my client. This suggestion came from people who heard my client communicate in alignment with her value of compassion. This conversation took place because my client stayed true to that value. The second example comes from something I heard on the radio about someone who faced pressure from his family to repost pro-Israel content on social media after the October 7th attacks. This man didn't do that. Instead of reposting what was expected or staying completely silent, he said something that was anchored in his value of honesty. He posted something like, I want to be honest. I am thinking daily of all the families who are losing loved ones. The 1,200 Israelis killed in the initial attacks, the thousands of Palestinians who have died since, the families of hostages still being held. And I'm learning more about this situation. If you have trusted sources for understanding this crisis better, I'd welcome them. His post elicited frustration from a couple of family members, but he said most people responded positively. They appreciated his honesty and shared resources with him to help him understand from multiple perspectives. Here's what I've learned from years of studying communication. The conversations that matter most are often the ones in which we risk disappointing others by staying true to our deepest values. Knowing that others may feel disappointed, upset, or angry, we become very mindful of expressing ourselves in a way that we can be heard. This means being aware of the words we choose, our body language and our tone of voice, and even emojis. This mindfulness about all these elements of our communication is a reflection of what's important to us, aka our values. Your willingness to communicate from your values, even when others may get caught in the reactive patterns, is not something neutral. It is a form of evolutionary activism. It's what can pave the way to healing, one conversation at a time. When you refuse to be pulled into right, wrong, or us versus them thinking, you are doing something revolutionary. You are modeling a different way of being with conflict. You are showing that it's possible to care deeply about human suffering without dehumanizing or using violent language with those who see the situation differently. You are showing that genuine concern for human well-being doesn't require enemy making. And perhaps most importantly, you are contributing to the kind of communication culture that might actually help solve these problems instead of perpetuating division. The world doesn't need more people taking sides. It needs more people willing to communicate from their deepest wisdom and stay connected across difference. Your voice, centered, compassionate, and committed to your values, is exactly what these conversations need. Now, before we end this episode, I also want to say that you don't have to engage with every difficult conversation. Sometimes the most conscious choice is to pause, breathe, and then decide if it would be skillful to engage in that particular moment. But when you do choose to engage, when you are centered enough that you have space for the pain of the world, then let your values be your North Star. Let them guide you towards language that heals rather than harms, that opens rather than closes, that honors the full humanity of everyone involved. The Palestinian families struggling to survive, the Israeli families grieving their losses, the hostages still being held, and the millions of Palestinians and Israelis around the world, and the billions of human beings in between who long for peace. This is language alchemy in action, using the power of conscious communication to transform not just our personal relationship, but our collective ability to navigate the most challenging issues of our time. And now, let's recap what you've heard in this episode. Today, we talked about how to talk about highly sensitive topics, and in particular, the topic of Israel and Gaza. I shared with you about the trap of taking a side immediately and how harmful it can be to take a stance without full knowledge of the complexities of this crisis. I also talked about how important it is to consider your values before you decide to engage and to anchor your communication in those values. I gave you several examples of what this can sound like, including real-life examples of people who expressed themselves in alignment with their values under peer pressure. Finally, I invited you to choose transformative and compassionate language that can bring us together rather than create more divisiveness. I know you are a messenger of peace, compassion, and healing. I know you, like me, can show up in these conversations like a language alchemist. If this episode was helpful to you, please share it with others who, like you, are committed to peace, compassion, and healing, or who would benefit from learning to communicate in alignment with their values, especially about highly sensitive topics. Thank you for listening. And a special thanks to all the people who are listening to the Language Alchemy podcast from places that are close to the war. Thank you to the listeners from Egypt, Israel, and the United Arab Emirates. It is an honor to bring Language Alchemy to you. Until next episode, and as we say in Argentina, ciao ciao. Original music by Gary Lapo. You can find all links in the show notes at languagealchemy.com.